Okay. The first one, they asked you to write down the asymptotes of f. That's the first one. The reason the sign changes is because we're actually saying x minus 3 equal to 0, and then the negative 3 goes over, and that's why it becomes plus. The other one you take just as it is. The reason we take it just as it is because this is y. It's already on the left hand side, and that one is already on the right hand side. So y equal to negative 1. Must be x, must be y. Not p, not q, not just the numbers. Equations. Next one, the domain of f. So you can learn it. When we work with a hyperbola, the domain is always x element of real numbers, and then you exclude the asymptote because that's the value it's not allowed to be. If it was a range, you'd say y an element of real numbers, and you'd exclude that asymptote. Easy. Next up, I asked you to find the values of d and e rounded off to a whole number, and then I told you that the graph of g has an inclination angle of 76. So in this question, they added some analytical geometry. So what you had to do was, or you have to realize that the inclination angle is created or exists because of the gradient. Okay, that's why it's always equal to the gradient. You can think for yourself, if you've got a straight line, let's consider that angle there. The bigger the gradient is, the bigger the angle will be. Nee. And that's why when it goes negative, we have to use a different method, and our method is to get ignore the negative, get the answer and subtract it from 180. Okay, so tan 76 equal to m, you press tan 76. Don't press shift here. We press shift when we add the gradient and we want the angle. And then I find m to be 4, I put it in the place of m, I use a coordinate given, and I find c to be negative 6. Then you write the equation. Then I said if a is 1 and negative 2 and c is 13 over 4 and 7, for which values of x is g of x greater than or equal to f of x. So I highlighted it. You use a ruler, especially when it's a hyperbola. Hyperbola can be very tricky. So here, which one is at the top is the hyperbola. Hyperbola, 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 up to the point of A. After A, straight line is at the top, and you always stop at the asymptote because we're working with the hyperbola as well. The hyperbola does not exist there. So therefore, I don't know which one is at the top or at the bottom. So it's going to be from 1 to 3. Then right after 3, can you see the yellow one is at the top? Just for a small part. From C onwards, the straight line is at the top again, to infinity. And that's how I get to my answer of 1. The reason I included it is because they asked greater than or equal to. So it's 1 included up to 3, 3 not included because it's an asymptote. And then 13 over 4 included, it's where they are equal to each other, and infinity always not included. Then determine the equation of the axis of symmetry of f that has a negative gradient. So when you have your hyperbola's equation, to get the axis of symmetry, you close that 2. You write it without the 2. X minus 3 minus 1. If you want the one with the negative, you put a negative only in front of the first 2. Do you remember when we completed the square, at the quadratic function? We also left that q value on the side. It didn't influence my calculations. So I only put a negative in front of these 2, multiply it in. You always have to simplify it to get to negative x plus 2. Do you all understand? Okay. Something I just want to say before we go on to the next one. There wasn't as many questions of that in this one. Make sure when the question says give the equation, that you give an equation. An equation means you've got x or y equal to whatever. So you don't just, like if you find a straight lines equation in this one, it's not enough to just find m and c. You have to write it in the equation. When they ask for the x and the y intercept of the hyperbola, maybe you had to calculate it. You know that question comes up a lot, né? Where you make x 0 in the denominator and then the next one you make y 0. Don't just find the values. They say calculate the coordinates of the x and the y intercept. Then you get your mark at the coordinate. So don't lose marks by leaving out stupid things like that. Okay, answer the question correctly. The next one was the graphs of f and g that you had to draw on the same axis, set of axes. Now, the first one, f, is a quadratic function. Its other name is a parabola. G is an exponential function that is not in standard form. If it was in standard form, it would look like this. G of x equal to negative 2 to the power of x plus 1. Please remember that negative 2 is not negative 2 to the power of x. It's negative 1 times 2 to the power of x. The base is always positive. Okay. Then I've given you that page and we spoke about it as well. Before you wrote the class test, I gave you that summary of things that you must have when you draw the graphs. So when we want to draw a quadratic function, you need to have the x-intercepts, the y-intercept, and the turning point. They must be there. In grade 10, you only had x and y. Now we're in grade 11. You need the turning point. You're not going to get a quadratic function that turns on the y-axis. You got that in grade 10. Its turning point is the most important part of the whole graph. Okay, so I took the quadratic function. First I got the x-intercepts. I let it be equal to 0 and I found my two answers, 3 and negative 1. Then I got my y-intercept. You can either go and make the x's 0 or you can just take the c value, because remember that is what the c value is. The c value is the y-intercept. Do you all understand? Okay. Then the turning point, either you use negative b over 2a and you substitute, you get 1. Then you take that answer and substitute it in the trinomial. Be sure you understand. As many times you can calculate the x, but you don't know how to get the y coordinate. You put it into the function, substitute it into the place of x, and then you find it to be 4, and you have your turning point 1 and 4. If you didn't use that formula, you could complete the square as well, and I did it here as well so that you can see. So when we complete the square, I take the negative out of the first two. That 3 is hanging on the outside. Then I take half of 2, which is 1. 1 squared is 1. I add it and I subtract it. These 3 make out the perfect square. So I write that negative, that one square root, that one sine, that one square root. That negative 1 needs to get out. It multiplies with negative, therefore it becomes plus 1. And that's how I end up with negative x minus 1 squared plus 4. This means, or what this is the same function as this one. It's just in a different format. This is the PQ format, and when it's in the PQ format, I can read the turning point from the equation. What will it be? It's this value with a negative, because it's negative P, this is P, negative P, and Q is your turning point. With the exponential function, you need the asymptote. I read it from the equation. And then you need the x and the y-intercept. I'm going to say it again. Sometimes you'll only have the x-intercept. Sometimes you'll only have a y-intercept. Sometimes the y and the x-intercept will be the same value. Okay. Right. You'll always have a y-intercept, but you won't always have an x-intercept. So I started with the x-intercept, I made y 0, the negative 1 came over, and then I have to divide with a negative on both sides. It becomes 2 to the power of x equal to 1, and then 1 can be written as 2 to the power of 0, and therefore x is 0. If you started by making x 0, you'd have negative 1 times 2 to the power of 0, which is negative 1. Plus 1 would also end up giving you 0. So we said, if you get to that, you need to understand that you don't have to calculate the y-intercept as well. Because both of them are 0, that means that is the intercept. Okay, it's cutting the x and the y axis there. And then I'm going to draw it. So, with the quadratic function, I made my two x-intercepts, negative 1 and 0, 3 and 0. I got my y-intercept, it's 0 and 3. I got my turning point, it's 1 and 4. So those were the points that I plotted first. And then I joined them. I gave it an arrow, and it went through. And this is the function f. Remember, all those coordinates must be on your graph. I now notice that I made a mistake. Okay, are you happy with the quadratic function? Alright, the exponential function, I put in my asymptote at y equal to 1. My intercept is at 0 and 0. So the standard one, if it was a whole number, would go like that. No? So I just reflect it, so this one is going to go like this. I'm going to write it here next to it again. If the base is 2, positive 2, looks like that. When it's a negative 2, it's this one, but to the bottom. It's reflected. If it is a half, it's from the top to the bottom. If it is negative a half, it is from the bottom to the top. And I'm just using 2.5 as an example. It can be 3 or a quarter or whatever. You understand that, no? So the one we had is the negative 2. Are you fine? Okay. I think now my 2.2 will be different as well. Let's just check it. Okay, so the question says that f for which values of x will f of x times g of x be greater than or equal to 0? So that means when the two graphs multiply, greater than 0 means positive, no? How do I get a positive answer when I multiply? Positive, positive, or negative, negative. So you can use your highlighter. I don't want to highlight now because I want to erase it now. But here this one is positive and this one is positive up to that point. Do you agree? Then this one is negative. So it's only up to that point, negative 1. Right here, up to 0. Both of them are positive. Can you see that? Positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, positive, up to 0. And then it's 1 positive, 1 negative, 1 positive, 1 negative, 1 positive, 1 negative, up to there. From 3 onwards, both of them will be negative. So I'm looking for the place where both of them are positive or both of them are negative. So it's going to be between -1 and 0 and from 3 to infinity. Plus times a plus will be a plus, negative times a negative will be a plus. Do you all understand that? Okay, so therefore my answer, they're asking greater than or equal to. It's going to be from -1 included, because there it's equal to 0, up to 0 included. Then from 3 included, up to infinity excluded. Okay, you done with that? Next one. They're asking you to find the y-intercept of t if t is negative g of x plus 1. So what is g of x? G of x is that 1 minus 2 to the power of x. Or you can say negative 2 to the power of x plus 1. That is g of x. So what they're saying is put a negative in front of that whole thing. Not just in front of the x, because g of x is the whole thing. You put a negative in front of the whole thing and you add 1 in the end. So what happens is I've got -1 plus 2 to the power of x plus 1. And -1 plus 1 is 0. Right? So it cancelled out. So t of x is going to be 2 to the power of x. And to get the y-intercept, I let x be equal to 0. And anything to the power of 0 is 1. It's 0 and 1. Do you understand? Must I explain it again? Again. Okay. I'm going to do it on a different page. I'll do it here. Right, they're asking for negative g of x plus 1. G of x is 1 minus 2 to the power of x, or if you've already changed it, it's 2 to the power of x plus 1. Do you want me to use the top one or the bottom one? Top one. Okay. So can you see this thing is g of x? If it looks like that, I can't do anything with it. Ne? Negative g of x. There it is. Nothing to be done. But I can take this thing and put it in the place of g of x. So the negative remains and the plus 1 remains. That's what they're adding to it. You just have to put in g of x. And g of x is negative 2 to the power of x plus 1. So all that negative does is it makes this one positive. It makes this one negative. And then minus 1 plus 1 is gone. So my equation is 2 to the power of x. Now they're asking for the y-intercept. The y-intercept is where x is 0. So 2 to the power of 0 is equal to 1. So my y-intercept is 0 and 1. You will lose marks. Because how did you get to that equation? You did what? But how did you know it's going to be 1? Did you guess? Okay, so then that answers your question. Okay. Or did you do it graphically? If you did it graphically, then you can write the answer, but you're gonna have to say from the graph. But then you're gonna have to know if you put a negative in front of it, it's flipping to the top. And then it's moved up 1, so it's gonna be there. So you can do it graphically, but then you're gonna have to say from the graph. Okay. Alright, 2.4. The graph of k is a reflection in the y-axis. Write down the equation. So when I have a reflection in the y-axis, I told you guys, then we put a negative in front of the x. Ne? Do you remember that? Reflection in y-axis is a negative in front of the x. Reflection in the x-axis is a negative in front of the y. So this is reflection in the y-axis, so you put a negative in front of the x. But as you remember from exponents in the first term, we cannot leave it as a negative exponent. I have to make it positive. What does a negative exponent mean? It's a fraction. So the correct equation will be negative a half to the power of x plus 1. So everything stayed the same except your base became a fraction. If it was a fraction, it would have become a whole number. Okay, can we move on to the analytical? Right, the first one. This was a pretty easy analytical question, eh? Did you guys notice that? The first one was the coordinates of M, the midpoint of BD. B's coordinates was given, B's coordinates was given, M is the midpoint. I calculated 5/2 and 0. And then they ask you to show that x is -3 and y is -6. So what I did is I used the midpoint. So I'm saying the midpoint of BD and the midpoint of AC is going to be equal because the diagonals bisect. That must be there because it's not common knowledge, it's your knowledge because it's a parallelogram. So I used my midpoint formula as an answer, and I calculated x to be -3 and -6. In this type of question, you know sometimes we can most cheat with the short method, ne? You know that? Okay. If you have the midpoint, you can count it. Listen to me. I want to show you. In this question, they said show that it's -3 and -6. So you can't go and use the shortcut and just write the coordinate -3 and -6. How do I know you used the shortcut or you just copied from the question? Because I gave the answer. Then you have to show the answer. Okay. Next one, the gradient of BC. I don't think there was any problems with it. You have both coordinates, substitute in the equation, you found an answer of 4. Then also gradient of BD. You have both coordinates, substitute 4/30. Did you get that? Show that triangle BDC is not rectangular. What would be different in a rectangle if you compare it with a parallelogram? What would this parallelogram have if it was a rectangle? 90-degree angles, equal diagonals. Okay, so you can choose which one you'd want to prove. I did it with the 90-degree angles. Okay, how do I find or determine 90-degree angles? I find the gradient of the one, I find the gradient of the other. If they're not opposite with a negative, then they're not 90 degrees. So I said, right, gradient of AB is -8/12, simplified to -2/3. Yeah, -2/3. And then the gradient of BD is negative 4 over 13. I already calculated at the previous one. So I say, see, when I multiply them, it won't give me negative 1. So therefore, it's not rectangular. You can add it there. If you use the equal diagonals, you would have used the distance formula to find the length of the diagonal AC and the diagonal BD, and then they won't be the same, and then you just say, so it's not a rectangle, because the diagonals aren't equal. Right, 3.6, the equation of AB. So you had the gradient of AB. I just calculated it. You can substitute it in there. And then you find C wide, and I simplify my gradient here. You can substitute it into your gradient, and then you find C to be 4, and therefore the equation is negative 2 over 3x plus 4. Did you get that? Okay. 3.7. Determine if B, D and the coordinate E, which is negative 18 and 6, if they are collinear. So I have the gradient of BD. I calculated it at 3.4. There it is. Then I calculated the gradient of BE. You could have calculated the gradient of DE as well. It doesn't matter. And I got 8 over negative 27. So I said no, they're not collinear. Did you get it like that? Do you understand? Okay, when they are collinear, the gradients will be the same. Right, and then 3.8 was a bit of a difficult one. Did you struggle with it? Okay, let me show you. Firstly, you know theta is not an inclination angle, ne? You all know that. Right, so I'm going to have to find theta by finding other inclination angles. So this one is a pretty safe bet, that one. I'll call it alpha. And then I'm struggling to find another one here. So all I did is I extended that line. And then I called this one beta. Because, do you agree with me, when I extend this line, it doesn't influence the gradient, it's the same gradient. So if I've got that angle, and I can calculate beta, then theta and beta will be the opposite interior angles of that exterior angle. Do you see the plan? Everyone? Okay? So I have the gradient of AB. It's negative 2 over 3. I calculated the gradient of AD, but you could have stolen it from BC, because they are parallel. But I calculated it, I found it to be 4. Then for alpha, I said the tan of alpha is equal to negative 2 over 3. I got the answer of 33,69. But because of that negative, remember you ignore it, but then you subtract your answer from 180 to get 146,3099, and I didn't round off yet. Then I found beta. I say tan beta equal to 4. Take it over, shift tan, nothing to ignore, nothing to subtract. I found it to be 75,963. And then I said theta plus beta is equal to alpha. It's the exterior angle of the triangle. And then theta is 70,35 degrees. Do you understand that? All of you? Where you would have gotten marks is 4 marks, so you'd get a mark here. The one was already calculated. This one was already calculated. You just get 1 mark there, 1 mark there. Exterior angle, answer. Okay, you all done? Right, let's do some planning with question 4. They said the diagram KING is a parallelogram. Then you got K and N's coordinates, and the line IG's equation is given by 4y equal to 2x plus 21. When you read that equation, does it bother you? Why? It's not in standard form. Okay, let's look at the graph or the diagram. So what I have is this parallelogram. I have to show that it is a rhombus. So can I show that the diagonals bisect? No, parallelograms diagonals bisect as well. Can I prove equal sides and parallel opposite sides? No, because a parallelogram has got those properties. What is different between a parallelogram and a rhombus? The diagonals? In both of them, one is longer and one is shorter. The diagonals are perpendicular when it's a rhombus. And then there's another property. No, square and a rectangle's got 90 degrees. Do you mean these angles? No, square, only square and rectangle. Do you remember, if you have a square, this is a square. Can you see my fingers? No? Can you see it there? Right. If someone sits on it, it would go like that. That's a square. That's a rhombus. That's a square. That's a rhombus. So can you see that the rhombus still has 4 equal sides? That's different between a rhombus and a parallelogram. So the one thing is the equal sides with a rhombus, or if it's like that, the sides are still equal. And the other thing is that the diagonals are perpendicular to each other. When we think of a parallelogram, there's a rectangle. If you sit on a rectangle, it goes like that. If you're too heavy, then it's a parallelogram. So remember it like that. The parallelogram is just the rectangle that went skew. A rhombus is a square that went skew. Okay, so the lengths of the sides you can figure out like that. Okay, so the two things are equal lengths, which seems a bit impossible to find because I don't have I and I don't have G. So I can't calculate that length, I can't calculate that length, I can't calculate that length, I can't calculate that length. Do you agree with that? Okay. The other property we said was that this line is perpendicular to this line. Then it is a rhombus. And can you see in the way that the question is stated, they are actually saying that it is a rhombus. You have to show it. So if this is a rhombus, then this gradient will be the reciprocal with a negative of this gradient. And that would mean it is a rhombus. Okay, do you get the plan? Now the reason why this plan will work is because of the equation. Because I can get the gradient from the equation without having the coordinates. There. Right, so Katlego, you said there's just something wrong with that equation. With the 4y equal to 2x plus 21, it's not in standard form. So we need to get it in standard form. It's y equal to a half x plus 21 over 4. So all I'm interested in is the gradient. So the gradient of IG is a half. Now I'm going to have to calculate the gradient of Kn. which is y to the power of y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. It's going to be 8 minus 2 over negative 2 minus, what is it, negative 2 minus 1. No. That gives me an answer of 6 over negative 3, which is equal to negative 2. Was that what I wanted to get? Yes. Because a half swapped around is 2 with a negative is negative 2. But now you have to answer the question because it's not common knowledge, it's your knowledge. So I have to say a half times negative 2 is equal to negative 1. Thus, IG is perpendicular to KN. Thus, king is a rhombus. But now you have to give your reason. Why is it a rhombus? Because the diagonals are perpendicular. Do you all understand? Everything in that question. Got it. I just quickly want to say a last thing to you. This is now Afrikaans, but this was the class test that you guys wrote. It's supposed to be in your books. No? Go and work it out again. I just want to talk about this one, 2.4. You remember this question where I said, show that A is negative 1 and B is negative 2 and C is 8. Do you remember what I told you about that question? You are not allowed to use A as negative 1 or B as negative 2 or C as 8. I'm asking you to show it. I just give you the answers because otherwise, if you don't get it, the rest of the things will all be wrong. It will work out in Gogo answers. Okay. So that's just something that I need you to remember. When I say, if I give you the equation of the straight line and I say, show that this is the equation of the straight line, then you ignore the fact that I've given it to you. You go and work it out as you would have normally. And then when you're done, you go and check, is it the same as what I gave? And remember, when we have a quadratic function, if I have the graph and I need to get to the equation, I can either have the turning point, substitute into P and Q, use a coordinate to find A, then you use the equation with A, P, and Q, and you multiply it out to get to the trinomial. No? Do you know what I'm talking about? The other option is, I give you the two x-intercepts. You substitute the two x-intercepts into that x2 and x1. You substitute another coordinate into the normal x and y to find the a value. Once you have the a value, you put it in the equation in the place of a, and you leave the two x-intercepts. You multiply it out, and then you find the normal trinomial to have A, B, and C's answer. Please use this test, this class test, and use this practice test to study. Go and learn your work, and then you go and write these tests again as if they are formal tests. Check your time. Is there anyone that has a question on anything? Ja, mevrou? Dis by meneer Lucian Junior. Any questions? We did it in class. And the memo discussion is on the on YouTube as well. I can, if you have your, do you have your phone here? I will hotspot it for you guys and give you the memo if you want to quickly download those videos. Okay.